Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and transform them into a shortcut to being well-informed, complete with surprising facts and just enough history to keep you hooked. Today, we are deep diving into the biography of a single figure whose life was so utterly vast, so packed with contradictory roles that it seems, well, impossible one person could have lived it all. We are talking about the Age of Enlightenment's true chameleon, Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais.
It truly is a dizzying curriculum vitae. When you look at the source material, you realize we're not just dealing with the man who wrote the famous Figaro plays, which is, what most people know him for today.
Right, that's the main headline for him.
Exactly. But we're talking about a man who was consecutively or sometimes simultaneously a highly successful watchmaker, a groundbreaking inventor, a court musician and musical advisor to the daughters of Louis XV, a spy running secret missions across Europe, a titanic publisher who ran the largest printing works on the continent, a successful arms dealer, and crucially, a revolutionary force whose work helped ignite both the American and French revolutions.
Our mission today for you, the listener, is to understand exactly how one man, born the son of a Parisian artisan, managed to hold so many seemingly incompatible positions, and what key contributions he made to history and culture that still resonate today. We are navigating a life that utterly defies the structure of the ancient regime, a time when birth determined everything. Yet this man's sheer wit and ambition allowed him to reshape his own destiny. We're looking at high society glamour, high drama court battles, and high-stakes diplomacy that quite literally helped birth a new nation.
Beaumarchais' life is the hinge. It's the pivot point between the structured world of absolute monarchy and the coming storm of revolution. We're going to trace his rapid rise from the artisan streets of the Rue Saint-Denis, track his famous legal battles that made him an overnight popular celebrity and a champion of the people, explore the creation of his revolutionary Figaro plays, and unpack his indispensable and financially devastating covert role in the American War of Independence.
And here's the initial nugget of historical irony that just sets the stage for this man's entire career. Beaumarchais is globally best known for creating Figaro, one of the great characters in operatic and theatrical history. But his involvement in the American Revolution, which was a deeply personal triumph that won him back his civil rights, turned out to be a financial nightmare.
Oh, a total disaster for him personally.
He struggled for decades long after the war was won to recover the money he personally invested in that crucial arms dealing scheme. The guy saved a revolution, and then his allies, the newly formed American government, effectively refused to pay him back for a generation.
An unbelievable story.
Okay, let's unpack this incredible ascent, because Beaumarchais starts with a name that is not aristocratic at all. Pierre-Augustin Caron. He's born in Paris in 1732. His father, André-Charles Caron, is a respectable watchmaker from Meaux, which places the family comfortably within the middle-class artisan category. They were industrious, but definitely not nobility.
And that family context, while it seems unremarkable on the surface, it really gives us insight into his political leanings later on. The sources note that the Caron family had previously been Huguenots French Protestants, but converted to Roman Catholicism following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes.
So this was a forced conversion, basically.
A forced conversion, exactly.
Yeah.
It was meant to allow them to continue living and working in Paris without persecution.
So they carried that generational memory of religious persecution and, well, forced conformity.
Precisely. And even though he was formally Catholic, Beaumarchais retained a lifelong, passionate sympathy for Protestants and consistently campaigned throughout his life for their civil rights. This early experience of the limits of state power and the necessity of religious tolerance profoundly informs his later political battles for liberty and his deep-seated distrust of absolute authority.
He had a happy childhood, reportedly spoiled as the only son with 5 sisters, a house full of women who adored him. He left school early, at 12, to apprentice under his father, which was completely standard for the time. Interestingly, the source suggests that his own youthful experiences during these years, the energy, the restlessness, the sense of being held back by routine, may have directly inspired the character of the page Cherubin in The Marriage of Figaro later on. That archetypal figure of youthful, slightly chaotic intensity.
But he was far from the ideal apprentice. I mean, the source material paints a picture of a clever, restless mind. He neglected his bench work so severely at one point that his father actually evicted him.
Kicked him out.
kicked him out, made him apologize for his poor behavior before allowing him to return. This tells us he had a natural intellect and enormous curiosity, but that curiosity needed to be pointed towards something genuinely challenging and exciting. And that excitement came through true technical innovation.
And here's where his genius first manifested: the breakthrough invention. Context is key here. In the mid-18th century, pocket watches were unreliable. They were worn mainly as costly fashion accessories for the wealthy. They simply didn't keep time accurately. They were status symbols, not precision instruments.
Exactly. Beaumarchais, spending nearly a year researching, solved a major technical flaw in the existing mechanism. In July 1753, at the age of 21, he invented a new watch escapement. Now, that's the tiny critical mechanism that regulates the transfer of energy from the mainspring to the timepiece. His invention made watches substantially more accurate, but critically for social acceptance, it allowed them to be far more compact.
So it wasn't just tinkering.
No, this advanced the state of the art significantly, providing the precision needed to make watches truly useful tools.
So he didn't just make a better watch, he miniaturized accuracy, which was a huge commercial advantage. But innovation always breeds jealousy, and this leads us to the infamous Laporte affair.
It's more than jealousy. It's a conflict between the upstart meritocrat and the entrenched elite. Jean-André Laporte, the long-established royal clockmaker, and, ironically, Beaumarchais' mentor, immediately recognized the brilliance of the invention.
And just stole it.
And stole the idea, flat out. He published a description of the mechanism under his own name in Le Mercure de France, claiming it as his own.
Most young artisans, when faced with a powerful royal clockmaker, would simply suffer the loss and move on. What was Beaumarchais' response?
His response is absolutely crucial because it provides the template for the rest of his career. He didn't quietly accept it. He immediately wrote a strongly worded public letter to the same newspaper defending his invention, describing the specific mechanisms, and calling out Laporte's infidelity and theft. He demanded that the French Academy of Sciences investigate, using verifiable science and engineering diagrams to prove his case.
He went straight for a public confrontation, backed by incontrovertible technical evidence. This wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a PR strategy.
A masterful one. The Academy, in February 1754, ruled decisively in his favor. This was far more than a technical victory. It was a massive public relations triumph. The source notes that the affair catapulted Beaumarchais to immediate stardom among the Parisian intelligentsia, while Laporte was relegated to infamy. He had learned a profound lesson that the power of a published, well-argued defense, the pen, could be a more powerful weapon than any social rank.
And that fame quickly translated into royal validation, the key to social mobility. Louis XV asked him to create a specialized, miniaturized watch mounted on a ring for his influential mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Louis was so impressed that he named Beaumarchais purveyor to the king, which immediately established and prospered the Caron family business.
This is his first great pivot. He has left the artisan class and gained access to the highest levels of the French court. The next step is cementing that access, which requires shedding the simple Caron name. In 1756, he strategically married the wealthy widow Madeleine Catherine Aubertin. It's after this marriage that he adopted the grander, more aristocratic name Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, derived from his wife's estate, Le Beaumarchais.
He essentially fabricated a noble lineage for himself through marriage and a geographical marker. It was a classic move of the ambitious middle class trying to buy into the existing system, and he gave up watchmaking entirely at this point.
His focus shifted entirely to social climbing and acquisition of formal titles. He became secretary counselor to the king around 1760-61, which was an expensive purchase title but gave him direct access to the French nobility. Following that, in 1763, he purchased the office of Lieutenant General of Hunting, overseeing royal parks, another prestigious, if largely administrative, role.
But these offices cost a fortune, right?
A fortune. And they quickly strained his finances, especially after his first wife died less than a year after their wedding.
So financial problems resurfaced. He was ambitious, but poor, and he solved his problems by charming the royal family again, but this time through music. He was appointed to teach Louis XV's 4 daughters the harp, quickly growing into the royal family's highly trusted musical advisor. It's an incredible lateral move from clock mechanism to court musician.
And that court connection introduced him to Joseph Paris Duvernay, an older, immensely wealthy entrepreneur and financier. Beaumarchais, demonstrating his early skill for securing royal favor, helped secure the king's approval for Duvernay's new project, the prestigious École Royale Militaire. In return, Duvernay promised to help make him rich.
And that's the final piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. They became close collaborators and friends, cementing Beaumarchais' position as a financier and businessman, not just an inventor or courtier. This patronage was what gave him the capital and connections necessary for international intrigue.
This alliance brings us to Section 2, where we see Beaumarchais applying his new court-honed skills to international affairs, starting with the Madrid sojourn in 1764. The pretext for the 10-month trip was deeply dramatic. He was supposedly traveling to Spain to help his sister Lizette, whose fiancé, José Clavijo y Fajardo, an official at the Ministry of War, had publicly abandoned her.
The family honor was definitely involved, for sure, but the sources make it clear that the primary driver for a trip of that length and expense was massive commerce and power brokering for Duvernay. Beaumarchais was primarily focused on striking huge business deals, including securing exclusive contracts for Spain's recently acquired colony of Spanish Louisiana.
What's fascinating, and where the complexities of the Enlightenment era hit hard, is the nature of these business deals. The sources note he was actively attempting to gain the right to import slaves to the Spanish colonies in the Americas.
It reveals the profound pragmatism, bordering on cynicism, that underpinned his pursuit of wealth and influence. I mean, he was a vocal champion of Protestant civil rights at home and would become the key arms dealer for a revolution founded on liberty.
And yet
he was simultaneously operating within the brutal economic norms of the time, seeking to profit from the slave trade. He sought wealth using any means available to solidify his position.
So was his true talent, performance, and influence not commerce itself? Because the actual business deals in Madrid failed, right?
They absolutely failed, but he demonstrated his flair for personal drama. Regarding his sister, he managed to corner Clavijo and publicly shame him into agreeing to marry Lizette, temporarily securing Clavijo's support for the business deals. However, when more details about Clavijo's conduct, and perhaps Beaumarchais' own aggressive negotiation tactics came out, the marriage was ultimately called off.
So he returned to France with little immediate profit, having failed commercially and socially. But the trip was far from useless. He acquired new experience, musical ideas, and crucially, inspiration for theatrical characters. The entire Clavijo affair was so dramatic that it became the basis for Goethe's 1774 tragedy, Clavigo, cementing his reputation even before he wrote his own masterpieces.
That ability to turn real-life failure and personal drama into profitable, sensational art is perhaps the single most defining characteristic of Beaumarchais. But before he became the superstar playwright, he had to navigate a decade of pure legal turmoil that threatened to wipe out everything he had built. The 1770s are dominated by his legendary court battles.
It all begins with the Duvernay inheritance dispute in 1770. His patron, Duvernay, died, and they had signed a statement canceling a debt of about £75,000 that Beaumarchais owed. Duvernay's heir, Count de Lablache, claimed this signed statement was a forgery.
Beaumarchais initially won the case in 1772, but Lablache appealed. And this is the moment the Guzman scandal erupts, transforming a private legal fight into a national cultural sensation that questioned the very legitimacy of the French judicial system. Magistrate Guzman overturned the verdict favoring Beaumarchais. Why? Because Beaumarchais, ever the pragmatist, had tried to secure a favorable meeting by giving money, a bribe, to Guzman through his wife, Madame Guzman.
Wait, let's pause there. He was trying to bribe a judge. This is the man who was about to be hailed as a champion of social justice and liberty. Was he a champion of liberty or just a champion of himself, willing to use the very corruption he later exposed?
That is the central paradox of Beaumarchais. He believed the system was inherently corrupt, so he felt justified in playing its game. But when the game turned against him, he leveraged the public's frustration with the system. Guzman overturned the verdict, but then publicly kept the money he received, or claimed he kept it for his wife's expenses, and ruled against Beaumarchais anyway. This was the moment of betrayal.
And the situation compounded, because Beaumarchais was jailed separately from February to May 1773 in a ridiculous dispute with the Duc de Chaulnes over the Duke's mistress. Lablache seized this absence to persuade Guzman to order Beaumarchais to repay all his debts to Duvernay, plus interest and legal expenses. Beaumarchais was being professionally and financially crushed by the legal establishment.
Instead of accepting defeat, he took that lesson he learned from the Lapote affair and amplified it to a national scale. He weaponized public opinion against the judiciary.
He published a sensational 4-part pamphlet, the Memoirs contre Guzman. This act made him an instant celebrity. The sources stress that the public, who already deeply distrusted the regional courts, known as the parliaments, saw him as a victim of institutional corruption and hailed him as an immediate champion for social justice and liberty. The judicial corruption was now public and undeniable.
The pamphlets were masterpieces of prose and dramatic storytelling. He didn't write legal briefs, he wrote compelling narratives, full of wit, passion, and devastating personal attacks. Guzman countered by launching his own lawsuit against Beaumarchais for libel, but Beaumarchais had already won in the court of public opinion.
And the outcome was incredible. On February 26, 1774, Guzman's initial ruling in the Lablache case was overturned, and the judge was permanently removed from his post. But because the courts needed to save face and uphold some semblance of authority, both Beaumarchais and Madame Guzman were sentenced to blame.
We need to explain what blame meant, because the term nominally deprived of their civil rights is too vague. Blame, meaning censure or reproach, was a public ritual of humiliation. It typically involved being brought before the court, publicly reprimanded, and essentially placed under a social cloud that limited the right to hold office, bring certain lawsuits, or appear at court functions. It was social death by judicial decree.
So he was publicly shamed and restricted, even though he had exposed the corruption. That's the irony of the ancient regime.
Yes, the establishment got their pound of flesh, but Beaumarchais had created an angry populist moment. The whole affair was so sensational that the judges had to flee the courtroom through a back door to avoid a large, angry mob that was waiting outside, baying for Guzman's blood.
So he lost his civil rights.
But he gained immense nationwide popular fame and proved the power of the published word to challenge authority.
So here's our pivot. Beaumarchais realized that his most powerful tool wasn't finance or law, but drama and public spectacle. After his applications to be a formal diplomat were rejected, perhaps because of the blame, he shifted his focus entirely to playwriting, turning his legal traumas into cultural touchstones.
He had already experimented with drama with Eugénie in 1767 and Les Deux Amis in 1770, but those were merely conventional. The revolutionary impact comes entirely from the Figaro trilogy, which gave voice to the frustrations he had just leveraged in court.
The trilogy centers on Figaro, the clever valet, and Count Almaviva, the aristocratic master, in all three plays: Le Barbier de Séville, Le Mariage de Figaro, and La Mère Coupable.
These characters, conceived during his time in Spain, didn't just entertain. They reflected and drove the change in social attitudes surrounding the French Revolution. They showed the decay and incompetence of the aristocracy and the rising consciousness, intelligence, and moral superiority of the servant class.
Figaro, the barber, is clearly the intellectual and moral center of the universe.
Absolutely. And they were intensely semi-autobiographical, which is why they resonated so deeply. Beaumarchais poured his own personality, ambition, and personal grudges into these figures. The page Cherubin, who is constantly pining and contemplating suicide when his love is to marry another, was based on the youthful, intense, romantic Beaumarchais. Suzanne, the clever heroine of the latter two plays, was modeled after his third wife, Marie-Thérèse de Villers-Malaz.
And he used the stage for revenge.
Oh, the best part. He inserted clear caricatures of his real-life enemies. Magistrate Guzman, the man who ruined him in the court battle, appears as Don Guzman Berdoizen in The Marriage of Figaro, a dull, pompous, incompetent judge. And his legal adversary in a later case, Nicolas Burgas, appears as Béguiers in The Guilty Mother.
That's the ultimate mic drop.
Mm-hmm.
He literally took his personal battles, put them on the national stage, and forced the entire Parisian elite to pay money to watch a comedy about his enemies being mocked.
It's a masterful use of media. Le Barbier de Séville premiered successfully in Paris in 1775 and was quickly exported across Europe. But the real explosion, the cultural event that redefined pre-revolutionary society, was the sequel.
Le Mariage de Figaro, the most explosive comedy of the era.
It was explosive because it contained Figaro's famous monologue, a 6-minute diatribe against the aristocracy and the absurdity of inherited privilege. The censor initially passed it in 1781, believing it was just another comedy, but when Louis XVI read the manuscript privately, he realized exactly what Beaumarchais was doing.
The king's reaction is legendary and proves the play's power. He stated, "This man mocks everything that must be respected in a government," and immediately banned its public performance. He realized the play was directly undermining the social hierarchy upon which his power rested, essentially giving the common people a vocabulary for their discontent.
But the ban, thanks to Beaumarchais' fame from the pamphlets, only increased the demand exponentially. Queen Marie Antoinette and her entourage reportedly lamented the ban, forcing private readings to be held. Beaumarchais, ever the master publicist, spent 3 years holding these private readings and making minor revisions to appease the king. The play became the single most eagerly anticipated piece of theater in all of France.
And when the king finally relented in 1784, the premiere was an unprecedented sensation. The crowd was so large and eager that 3 people were reportedly crushed to death at the gates.
And here's the incredible irony, which speaks volumes about the blindness of the late ancient regime. The play was enormously popular, even with the aristocratic audiences it was directly satirizing.
Why would they laugh at their own demise?
The sources suggest a few reasons. First, they enjoyed the illicit, forbidden nature of the performance. They were attending the play the king had banned. Second, many aristocrats were culturally enlightened and enjoyed the sharp wit, seeing the corruption and incompetence reflected in the play as being applicable only to other aristocrats, not themselves.
So they were laughing at themselves, but they didn't know it. The success was so enormous that it launched global operatic traditions.
Absolutely. The legacy of these plays, for you the listener, is indelible in the history of music. Paisiello adapted The Barber of Seville in 1782, and Rossini's 1816 version remains one of the greatest comedic operas ever written. And perhaps most famously, Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro premiered just 2 years after the play, in 1786, transforming Beaumarchais' social commentary into an operatic masterpiece that continues to be performed globally.
The impact of this trilogy is undeniable. It did not just entertain, it culturally prepared the ground for the idea that the old social order was inherently ridiculous, corruptible, and ripe for overthrow. Now we arrive at the central paradox of his life. How the disgrace of the blame sentence, the public shaming, ironically provided the leverage that forced him into the world of espionage and international diplomacy, transforming him from a disgraced playwright into the savior of the American Revolution.
That is the perfect transition. Beaumarchais needed to restore his civil rights, which had been stripped away by the blame. To do that, he pledged his absolute confidential services directly to Louis XV. The king now had an ambitious, talented man with vast contacts who was totally dependent on the crown for redemption. It was the perfect blackmail scenario.
So he transitioned from cultural provocateur to secret agent for the French crown. What were his initial missions?
His first missions were classic palace intrigue. He traveled to London, Amsterdam, and Vienna on behalf of the king, primarily focused on cleaning up embarrassing messes. The source lists 2 specific assignments: persuading the eccentric French spy Chevalier Dion, who was living in London and threatening to expose state secrets, to finally return home, and destroying a scandalous pamphlet, Les Mémoires secrets d'une femme publique, which libeled one of Louis XV's powerful mistresses, Madame du Barry.
He was running PR cleanup for the crown while trying to win back his honor. But while he was in London, he started gathering intelligence on a much bigger issue, one that would redefine the Atlantic world. The escalating conflict between Britain and its American rebels, which broke out into fighting in 1775.
This is the critical moment. Beaumarchais became an extremely influential source of information for the French government, sending reports back to France detailing the rebels' situation. Crucially, the sources note that these reports were highly persuasive, often containing exaggerated rumors of the resilience and success of the rebel forces. He wasn't just reporting facts, he was lobbying. He was using his intelligence briefings to push the French into taking action against Britain, their historic enemy.
The French government, led by Louis XVI, had a classic dilemma. They desperately wanted to see Britain defeated and humiliated, but they could not afford to openly break with Britain and risk a formal war yet. They needed a middleman, a proxy. They needed a completely covert operation.
And Beaumarchais presented the perfect, deniable solution. Louis XVI, and crucially his foreign minister, Vergennes, allowed Beaumarchais to found a commercial enterprise known as Roderick Horpalez and Company. This company was secretly supported by huge infusions of cash from both the French and Spanish crowns, but it operated ostensibly as a private merchant house.
The goal was clear and urgent: supply arms, munitions, clothes, and financial aid to the American rebels before France formally entered the war in 1778. Beaumarchais wasn't just managing the books, he was the front man, personally guaranteeing the operations, often using his own capital and credit when official royal funds were slow to arrive.
The scale of this aid which he procured and shipped was absolutely massive and undeniably critical to the survival of the Continental Army in the early, darkest days of the war. We have a direct quote from his August 1776 letter to the Committee of Secret Correspondence, signed under the alias Roderick Horpalez & Co.
Let's talk specifics, because the logistics of this are astounding. What exactly did this one man procure and deliver?
He outlined the specifics in detail. About 200 pieces of brass cannon, 4-pounders. Additionally, 20,000 pounds of cannon powder, 20,000 of excellent fusils, some brass mortars, bombs, cannonballs, bayonets, platines, clothes, linens, etc., for the clothing of your troops, and lead for musket balls.
So this was effectively a full military supply chain shipped across a hostile Atlantic patrolled by the British Navy.
This was the difference between General Washington fielding a revolutionary army and fielding a few hungry, poorly equipped militias. The impact is staggering.
And it all came to a head in 1777.
Yes. It culminated with the decisive military impact at the Battle of Saratoga. The source states explicitly that John Burgoyne's army capitulated at Saratoga to a rebel force that was largely clothed and armed by the supplies Beaumarchais had been sending. This victory was pivotal, securing the rebels a crucial tide-turning triumph. Beaumarchais, upon hearing the news, raced into Paris in such a frenzy that he was injured in a carriage accident, smashing his coach in his eagerness to deliver the news.
He literally risked life and limb to deliver the news of the triumph he had personally engineered and financed, and his logistical commitment was total. In April 1777, he purchased an old 50-gun ship of the line, the Hippopotame, renamed it Pierre-Rodrigue, Proud Roderick after his company alias, and used it to ferry massive shipments of arms and men across the Atlantic to the insurgents. This was a private fleet serving a public revolutionary cause.
His services were so critical and successful that they provided the final justification the French needed to move from covert support to open war. For all his efforts and services to the crown, the French Parliament officially reinstated Beaumarchais' full civil rights, erasing the blame in 1776. And in 1778, shortly after the Saratoga triumph, France and Spain formally entered the war after signing the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance.
So he successfully manipulated the global political scene, restoring his personal honor by facilitating the birth of a new nation. But now I have to circle back to the dark side of that initial fact nugget, the payment. The American government, in the form of Arthur Lee, their commissioner in Paris, immediately spread the rumor that these crucial supplies were a free gift from the French crown, not a commercial enterprise that needed to be paid back.
This is the ultimate narrative tension. Beaumarchais invested an enormous personal fortune, millions of livres, into Roderigue Hortense and Company, often borrowing heavily. He expected payment from the Continental Congress. Lee's malicious and perhaps mistaken rumor created immediate confusion in Philadelphia. George Washington's quartermasters simply didn't know if they had to pay for the crucial goods they were receiving.
And what was the American response?
They stalled. Beaumarchais was left trying to collect millions of livres from a brand new, nearly insolvent government, struggling with war debt and bureaucratic chaos. The source makes it clear that this wasn't necessarily malice, it was bureaucratic paralysis compounded by Arthur Lee's relentless campaign against Beaumarchais. For the next 2 decades, until his death and beyond, Beaumarchais dedicated immense resources to suing the American government.
He literally won a revolution and then spent the rest of his life as a supplicant trying to collect the tab. The irony is excruciating. It wasn't until 1835, 36 years after Beaumarchais' death, that the United States Congress finally agreed to pay his heirs a fraction of the debt owed, settling the claim at about 800,000 francs.
It highlights the ultimate contradiction. Beaumarchais excelled at dramatic confrontations that lasted weeks or months, like the Lapote or Gersman affairs, but he was completely unprepared for the glacially slow, impersonal bureaucracy of government insolvency and long-term debt collection. He had secured liberty for America, but lost his personal fortune doing it.
His life is a series of grand gestures, often financially ruinous. That brings us to his later career, and another incredibly ambitious venture, the preservation of Voltaire. After the great philosopher's death in 1778, many of his manuscripts were banned in France due to their anti-clerical and politically provocative nature.
Beaumarchais, the champion of Enlightenment ideals, stepped into the void. He bought the rights to most of Voltaire's manuscripts, understanding that censorship meant they would be lost to history. To completely evade French censorship and print the philosopher's complete uncensored works, he established the Société littéraire typographique de Kehl in Kehl, Germany, right across the Rhine from France.
This was not a small publishing house operating out of a back room. This was an industrial-scale operation.
It was titanic. The company quickly became the largest printing works in all of Europe. To ensure the highest possible quality for the great Voltaire, he went to extraordinary lengths. He bought the complete foundry, including all the punches and molds of the famous English type designer John Baskerville from his widow.
Acquiring the Baskerville foundry, renowned for its elegant, readable typefaces, and transporting it from England, then an enemy state, across Europe to Germany, Must have been a logistical nightmare.
It was an act of extraordinary industrial ambition, requiring intricate negotiations and massive capital investment. Furthermore, he purchased 3 separate paper mills to ensure a consistent, high-quality supply of paper for the monumental task.
70 volumes of Voltaire's complete works were published between 1783 and 1790.
This single-handedly preserved many of Voltaire's later, most politically challenging works that otherwise might have been destroyed. It was a cultural triumph of epic proportions.
But of course, it was a financial failure.
Of course. The cost of the industrial machinery, the paper, the logistics, and the sheer scale of the operation overwhelmed the eventual sales figures. Beaumarchais perpetually alternated between enormous, selfless cultural service and financial devastation. He seemed constitutionally unable to engage in a low-risk venture.
And his financial and social success caught up with him right as the French Revolution was brewing. His social reputation was damaged in one last major court battle in 1787, the Cornman Affair.
He sided with Madame Cornman in her adultery suit against her husband, M. Cornman, who was assisted by the celebrity lawyer Nicolas Bergasse, the same lawyer he would later satirize in The Guilty Mother. While Cornman and Bergasse were eventually found guilty of slander in 1790, Beaumarchais' own reputation was also tarnished. He was increasingly seen less as Figaro, the witty commoner, and more as the disruptive, wealthy manipulator.
So by the time the French Revolution broke out in 1789, he had completely fallen from grace as the popular idol.
That is the tragic, supreme irony of his life. He was the figurehead of pre-revolutionary sentiment, his plays inspiring the populace, but when the actual revolution began, he was deeply critical of its excesses, believing they endangered true liberty. He had become too successful. He was financially wealthy, partly from lucrative contracts supplying drinking water to Paris, and he had acquired ranks in the French nobility.
He even built a lavish residence directly opposite where the Bastille had stood, the symbol of the revolution. He became, tragically, the Count Almaviva he had spent 2 decades satirizing.
His association with the old regime quickly put him in mortal danger. He spent a week in jail in August 1792 for criticizing the government, and the timing was chilling. He was released only 3 days before a massacre of prisoners took place there. Desperate to prove his loyalty to the new regime, he pledged his services to the new republic, attempting to purchase 60,000 rifles for the Revolutionary Army from Holland.
He was trying to save the French Republic just as he saved the American colonies by supplying vital arms.
The rifle deal failed, and while he was abroad on this mission, his enemies finally found a way to ruin him politically. They falsely declared him an émigré, a loyalist who had fled the country to support the old regime.
The man who was condemned by the king, then saved the American revolutionaries, was now persecuted by the revolution he helped inspire.
That false declaration forced him into 2.5 years of exile, mostly spent in Germany, with his fortune confiscated. He endured profound poverty and uncertainty until 1796, when his name was finally removed from the list of proscribed émigrés.
He returned to Paris and lived out the remainder of his life in relative peace, passing away on May 18, 1799, at the age of 67. He is buried in the Père-Lachaise cemetery, a fitting final rest for a life that was one long, turbulent drama. It's genuinely astonishing to recap the sheer scope of Beaumarchais' existence.
Yeah.
He truly was the only watchmaker in history who personally outfitted a revolutionary American army, created Europe's largest publishing house to preserve the works of a controversial philosopher like Voltaire, and wrote plays so provocative they not only incited revolutionary fervor, but launched global operatic traditions that are still performed constantly today.
And you must briefly touch on the personal life twist, because it's as dramatic as his plays. He married 3 times, and his first 2 wives died under what the sources coyly call mysterious circumstances. One was believed to suffer from tuberculosis, but the persistent rumor spread by his many enemies was that he had poisoned them for the inheritance. Crucially, no evidence was ever produced, but the rumor and stain persisted throughout his lifetime, adding fuel to his already controversial public image. He lived with his 3rd wife, Marie-Thérèse, for 12 years before they finally married, perhaps in defiance of the established social norms he had spent his life flouting.
The life of Beaumarchais truly encapsulates the transition of the Enlightenment, where intelligence and wit began to supersede inherited status.
That's the final takeaway for you, the learner, in navigating this biography. What stands out is how Beaumarchais used every aspect of his life and personality as a tool for advancement and, ultimately, for revolution. His technical intelligence gave him the watch escapement. His social dexterity gave him access to the royal court. His flair for drama gave him the power of the pamphlet and the stage, turning personal legal defeats into public victories for justice. He proved that the relentless pursuit of personal wealth and status could, sometimes, accidentally align with the greatest political movements of his time, like the fight for American independence.
We've traced a life where his characters, Figaro and Almaviva, changed with the times, reflecting social decay and political revolution. If Beaumarchais were alive today, given his background as a technical inventor, a successful entrepreneur, publishing water supply, and a figure who mastered media manipulation, the Gozman pamphlets, which one of his many roles do you think he would find the most powerful for challenging authority? The artist, the spy, or the entrepreneur? Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.